I watched my husband pack his passport the same way he always folded his shirts, carefully, confidently, as if nothing in the world could wrinkle his plans. The suitcase lay open on our bed, neat and deliberate. Across the room his phone buzzed once, then again. He smiled at the screen, a smile he no longer saved for me. They thought I didn't notice. They thought I was the kind of woman who stayed quiet because she was afraid to ask questions. The kind who smiled through discomfort, who nodded at explanations that never quite added up. For years I had been praised for that silence. "You're so understanding," his mother used to say. "You don't make things difficult." So when he said he was traveling more for work, I didn't argue. When I saw unfamiliar charges and transfers, I didn't confront him. When his family started whispering about visas, international schools, and new beginnings, I didn't interrupt. I watched, I listened, I learned. They were careful. I'll give them that. Every conversation stopped when I entered the room. Every document was slid into folders I was never meant to open. The story they told each other was clean and simple. A man starting over, supported by his family, finally free of a marriage that had grown inconvenient. What they didn't realize was that silence is not the same thing as blindness. I didn't ask where the money was going. I didn't ask why he needed certified copies of documents that had nothing to do with his business. I didn't ask why a woman I had never met suddenly appeared in family discussions about the future. I let them believe what they wanted. Because sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let people think you know nothing at all. By the time the lawyer turned pale, it was already too late. I had married Allison believing stability was built on compromise. I was a high school teacher, used to structure, to rules, to patience. He was ambitious, restless, always chasing the next opportunity. In the early years, our differences felt complementary. I grounded him. He pushed me forward, or so I thought. Over time, the marriage cooled into something transactional. We shared a house, accounts, routines. Conversations became logistical. Love was replaced by efficiency. When I sensed distance, I blamed myself for not being exciting enough, not flexible enough, not modern enough. Then there was Victoria. I never caught them in the dramatic way stories like this are usually told. No lipstick on collars, no whispered phone calls in the dark. What I noticed instead were patterns. His phone angled away from me. A new protectiveness over his schedule. A defensiveness that didn't match the questions I asked. Victoria wasn't a secret because he was careless. She was a secret because she was planned. She appeared in conversations indirectly at first. A friend of a friend. Someone who needed help. Someone who was temporary. But nothing about her presence felt temporary. She was practical, focused, eager to move forward. She talked about life the way Allison talked about investments, always in terms of return. The affair alone would have been enough to break me once. Years ago, I might have confronted him, demanded explanations, begged for honesty. But what I began to understand was far worse than infidelity. They weren't just planning to leave each other, they were planning to leave everything. The country, the assets, the obligations, me. I learned about the plan the way I learned most things in that marriage, by being underestimated. A folder left on the printer, an email address saved on a shared device, a casual remark from his sister about getting things ready overseas. His family was involved. Every one of them. They talked about logistics openly when they thought I wasn't listening. Passports expedited, accounts prepared, flights coordinated. They spoke about the future as if it were already secured, as if nothing could reach them once they crossed a border. And through it all, they never once asked what I thought. I realized then how completely they had erased me from the equation. I wasn't an obstacle, I wasn't a risk. I was a background detail, already resolved in their minds. That was their first mistake. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't demand answers. I didn't cry in front of them or threaten consequences. I went to work. I taught my classes. I cooked dinner. I listened to Allison talk about timelines and opportunities as if I were still his partner. At night, when the house was quiet, I started opening drawers I had ignored for years. Filing cabinets, old folders, digital archives backed up and forgotten. Documents we had signed together without discussion because trust had once felt safer than scrutiny. What I found wasn't a secret account or a hidden will. It was something far more ordinary. Language, clauses, conditions that had been sitting there all along, waiting for the right moment to matter. I began to understand something important. People like Allison don't fear betrayal. They fear systems, and systems don't care who you love or who you plan to run away with. They only care what you signed. By the time the escape plan was complete, by the time his family felt confident enough to celebrate quietly, I had already stopped being afraid of losing him. I was afraid of losing myself. And that was the moment everything changed. The first time I realized how carefully they were planning, it wasn't through a confession or a slip of guilt. It was through routine, through how ordinary everything looked while something extraordinary was being assembled behind my back. Allison started coming home later, but not unpredictably. His absences followed a pattern as if mapped out in advance. Tuesdays were for meetings, Thursdays for networking. Weekends were suddenly flexible, open to last-minute changes that never needed explanation. He stopped asking me to adjust my schedule and simply informed me when plans shifted, as if my time had become irrelevant to his future. At first, I told myself this was what ambition looked like. I had spent years convincing myself that discomfort was a reasonable price for stability. When something felt wrong, I learned to explain it away before it ever reached my voice. Silence had become second nature, almost reflexive. Then the paperwork began to surface. Not all at once, never dramatically. Just enough to register. A courier envelope on the kitchen counter, a locked folder on the shared computer that hadn't been there before. Copies of documents I recognized but couldn't immediately place. Marriage certificates, property records, identification forms that had nothing to do with his real estate work. I didn't confront him. I didn't ask what they were for. I let them sit where they were, untouched, as if I hadn't noticed them at all. That was when I began to understand how deeply they underestimated me. His family became more visible in the process. They called more often, dropped by without notice. Conversations shifted the moment I entered the room, then resumed with forced normalcy. His sister talked too loudly about timelines and logistics. His mother asked questions that were framed as concern but felt like inventory checks. Everything revolved around preparation. I heard words like processing, verification, and clearance used casually over dinner. I listened to discussions about international banking regulations, spoken with the confidence of people who believed they were untouchable. They spoke about borders as if crossing one would erase everything behind them. They never included me in those conversations, not even to reassure me, not even to lie convincingly. That omission told me more than any confession ever could. Victoria entered the picture more clearly during this time, though still never directly acknowledged. She was always just out of frame. Her name appeared in conversations as a logistical necessity, not a moral complication. She was someone who needed documentation, someone whose future had to be secured, someone who couldn't wait. I noticed how Allison's tone changed when he spoke about her. He became efficient, almost managerial. There was no romance in his voice, no tenderness. Whatever they shared wasn't love in the way I had once believed in love. It was alignment, convenience, a shared direction. She wanted out, he wanted forward. Together they wanted everything they could carry. What chilled me wasn't the affair, it was the coordination. They didn't behave like people hiding something risky. They behaved like people following a checklist. Each task completed brought visible relief, a sense of progress that made them careless in small ways. They assumed the biggest danger had already been neutralized. Me. I started paying closer attention to the language they used when they thought I wasn't listening. Phrases like clean transfer, temporary holding, no exposure. They spoke about assets the way surgeons talk about organs, detached and precise. There was no acknowledgement of the life those assets had built, no mention of partnership or obligation. I realized then that they didn't see what they were doing as betrayal. They saw it as optimization. At home, I remained exactly who I had always been. I cooked, I graded papers, I asked Allison how his day had gone and listened as he answered vaguely. I didn't flinch when his phone buzzed late at night or when he stepped outside to take calls he didn't want me to hear. Inside, though, something had shifted. I began reviewing things I had ignored for years. Not obsessively, methodically. Old folders from tax seasons long past. Digital copies of documents we had signed together when trust felt easier than caution. Agreements I had skimmed because I believed the most important thing had already been secured: marriage. I wasn't searching for evidence of infidelity. I wasn't looking for proof to confront him with. I was trying to understand the structure of the life we had built, and where I fit within it legally. What I found surprised me, not because it was hidden, but because it was ordinary. Standard language, boilerplate clauses, sections that most people skip because they seem irrelevant until they aren't. The more I read, the clearer the picture became. Their plan depended on speed and silence, on the assumption that once they moved, whatever remained behind would no longer matter. They believed distance would protect them. They were wrong. I didn't feel anger as that understanding settled in. I felt something colder and far more stable. Clarity. The kind that doesn't rush you toward action, but tells you exactly when not to move. They thought I was staying quiet because I had no leverage. They didn't realize I was staying quiet because I was learning where the pressure points were. And once you see how a system is built, you don't need to break it. You only need to let it do what it was designed to do. I didn't start with the dramatic moments. I started with the boring ones. The years that blur together when nothing seems wrong enough to demand attention. Boxes in the basement held old tax returns and closing statements, stacked in the order we had filed them. I carried them upstairs one by one, spreading papers across the dining table after dinner, while Allison watched television in the next room. The sound of the game masked the soft shuffle of pages. He never asked what I was doing. That, too, told me something. I read slowly, not looking for a smoking gun, but for patterns. Dates, signatures. The way our names appeared together, then apart, where my consent had been assumed, where it had been required, where it had quietly been written into the structure of things without either of us ever talking about it. There were contracts I remembered signing in a rush, reassured by his voice telling me it was standard, routine, nothing to worry about. At the time, I had believed him. Trust, after all, is efficient. It saves time. It keeps the peace. Now I noticed the language I had skipped. Phrases about disclosure, about intent, about joint responsibility in the event of transfers or concealment. They weren't warnings. They were safeguards. Not designed for people like us, I had once assumed. People who planned ahead and paid their taxes and stayed within the lines. But safeguards don't care who you think you are. Each night I took notes in a small notebook I kept tucked inside a cookbook. Page numbers, clause titles, cross-references. I didn't Google anything yet. I didn't call a lawyer. I didn't want interpretation. I wanted understanding. The more I read, the more I realized how much of our life had been built on assumptions rather than conversations. Allison assumed speed mattered more than transparency. He assumed family loyalty would override risk. He assumed that if something had worked before, it would work again. He assumed I would never look. The flashbacks came without warning. Moments I had filed away as insignificant returned with new clarity. Allison urging me to sign before a notary closed for the day. His sister hovering nearby offering coffee and distraction. His mother insisting it was better not to overthink legal language. I had laughed then, embarrassed by my own hesitation. I had told myself I was being difficult. That was the word they always used when a woman asked for time. Now those moments rearranged themselves into a pattern. Not a conspiracy, a culture. A family that valued momentum over scrutiny, loyalty over legality. They didn't see rules as boundaries. They saw them as obstacles to be navigated. That worked until it didn't. Victoria's role became clearer as I connected the dots. She wasn't an accessory. She was a catalyst. Her urgency had accelerated everything. She wanted certainty, timelines, guarantees. She didn't have years to wait for a life to resolve itself. She needed outcomes. That pressure pushed Allison to move faster than he ever had with me. Faster than the systems we lived under were designed to tolerate. One evening, while he showered, I opened his laptop. Not to snoop, but to confirm what I already suspected. The folder I had noticed earlier was still there, more populated now. Scans of passports, correspondence with advisors, drafts of agreements saved and revised multiple times. What stood out wasn't what was hidden. It was what was sloppy. Overconfidence leaves fingerprints. I closed the laptop without opening anything else. I didn't need details, I needed timing. They were close enough to feel safe. I slept better than I had in months that night. The next morning I noticed a new tone in the house. Excitement, barely contained. Phone calls taken with the door half closed instead of fully shut. Laughter that felt premature. They were celebrating the idea of departure, not realizing how visible they had become in the process. At work, I taught my classes as usual. I discussed literature, themes of agency and consequence, the way characters often misunderstand the forces shaping their lives. As I spoke, I felt a strange sense of alignment. For once, my inner world and my outer one were moving in the same direction. I wasn't planning revenge. That word suggests emotion, impulse, a desire to hurt. What I was doing required none of that. It required patience, accuracy, restraint. I knew now that there was a mechanism embedded in the very paperwork they relied on. A threshold that, once crossed, didn't care about intention or justification. It responded to actions, not explanations. They were already crossing it. That evening, Allison mentioned his upcoming travel with casual certainty. He spoke about opportunities abroad as if they were invitations rather than exits. I nodded at the right moments, asked the right neutral questions. I played my role perfectly because it was the same role I had always played. Inside, I marked another box in my notebook. I understood then why silence had always served me. Not because it made me smaller, but because it made others careless. People reveal more when they think there's no one listening who matters. They thought the danger was confrontation. They prepared for arguments, accusations, emotional fallout. They never prepared for procedure. And that was the difference. I didn't need to stop them. I didn't need to warn anyone. I only needed to wait until their own actions completed the sequence. Once that happened, the system would take over. And systems, unlike people, don't hesitate. By the time I understood what they were really doing, the past no longer felt random. It felt arranged. I began replaying moments that had once seemed insignificant. Allison insisting we move money temporarily to simplify a closing. His brother joking about how complicated joint ownership could be if people didn't plan ahead. His mother reminding me more than once that marriage worked best when one person handled the details and the other trusted the process. At the time, I had taken those comments as personality quirks. Now they sounded like instructions. I revisited documents I had already read, this time with context instead of curiosity. Clauses that once felt abstract suddenly carried weight. Words like disclosure, intent, consent, and jurisdiction were no longer legal filler. They were conditions, triggers, lines that once crossed didn't bend back into place. What struck me most was how ordinary it all was. There was no secret trust hidden offshore, no forged signature. Everything they were doing was legal on its own. The danger wasn't any single action, it was the sequence. They were stacking moves too quickly, transferring funds while applying for documents, coordinating accounts while finalizing travel, assigning authority without disclosure. Each step nudged them closer to a threshold they didn't know existed. That threshold didn't announce itself. It waited. The flashbacks kept coming, sharper now. Allison brushing off my questions years earlier with practiced reassurance. "It's standard," he'd said over and over. "Everyone does it this way." His confidence had always felt comforting. I had mistaken certainty for safety. I remembered signing papers at the kitchen counter while dinner cooled on the stove. I remembered the notary's stamp pressing into the page, final and heavy. I remembered how relieved everyone seemed once the paperwork was done, as if something fragile had been secured. It had, just not in the way they thought. Victoria's presence made more sense now, too. She wasn't part of the foundation. She was pressure applied at exactly the wrong moment. Her impatience accelerated decisions that should have been spaced out, reviewed, disclosed. She didn't know our history, the layers of shared ownership and obligation that couldn't be rushed without consequence. She only knew what Allison told her, And Allison had always believed speed was a form of intelligence. I didn't tell anyone what I was realizing. Not a friend, not a colleague, not even myself out loud. Saying it would have made it real too soon, forced me into decisions I wasn't ready to make. Silence gave me space to think. Instead, I watched. I listened to conversations that weren't meant for me. I noted the confidence in their voices as they talked about being almost done, almost clear, almost free. I heard the relief when visas were approved and accounts confirmed. They spoke as if completion were protection. They never considered visibility. One afternoon, Allison mentioned a lawyer by name, casually, as if dropping it into conversation would normalize everything. He said the lawyer was handling the final details, and that there was nothing for me to worry about. I nodded, the way I always did. Inside, I understood something important. Lawyers don't protect you from systems. They guide you through them. And once a process is triggered, even the best lawyer can only explain what's happening, not stop it. That night, I lay awake thinking about timing, about thresholds, about the difference between intervention and activation. If I acted too early, everything would reset. Documents could be refiled, transfers undone, plans adjusted. If I acted too late, I would be trapped in the aftermath, forced into damage control I didn't want. There was a narrow window where everything they were doing would lock into place, where the system would see the full picture, not fragments, where explanations wouldn't matter. I realized then why I hadn't felt angry. Anger demands immediacy. It pushes you to speak, to confront, to demand. What I felt instead was patience, heavy and deliberate. The kind that comes from knowing you don't need to rush because time is no longer working against you. The next morning, I watched Allison leave for work with a confidence I hadn't seen in years. He kissed my cheek absently, already halfway out the door. He believed the hardest part was behind him. I went to school and taught my classes, my voice steady as I discussed narratives and turning points. I talked about how stories often hinge on moments characters don't recognize as pivotal until much later. My students listened, unaware of how literal the lesson felt to me. When I returned home, I reviewed my notes again, aligning dates and actions. The sequence was nearly complete. The pressure had built exactly where it needed to. I understood now that the trap wasn't something I would set. It was something they had already built, piece by piece, assuming no one was watching closely enough to see the whole structure. All I had to do was let it stand. I didn't need to expose them. I didn't need to stop them. I didn't need to say a word. The system was waiting. And so was I. I thought about speaking up more than once, usually late at night when the house was quiet and the weight of everything pressed harder. There were moments when the words rose to the back of my throat, sharp and ready. Questions, accusations, warnings. I swallowed them all. Intervening would have felt powerful, but it would have been the wrong kind of power. It would have alerted them, forced adjustments, given them time to correct whatever vulnerabilities they hadn't noticed yet. Confrontation would have made me visible, and visibility would have protected them. So I stayed where I was, invisible, ordinary. I watched Allison rehearse confidence like a habit. He spoke in absolutes now, not possibilities. The plan was no longer forming, it was formed. His family mirrored that certainty. They talked about departure dates the way people talk about weather, as if it were inevitable and out of anyone's control. The assumption that nothing could stop them settled into every conversation. That assumption was doing most of the work for me. I resisted the urge to rush. Rushing would have been familiar. It would have looked like panic, like desperation. I had learned long ago how quickly people dismiss a woman who reacts too soon. Urgency reads as instability. Silence reads as consent. Let them read me wrong. Instead of acting, I refined my understanding. I returned to the documents with a different question in mind, not what they were doing, but when their actions would become irreversible. I mapped out timelines the way I used to map out lesson plans, noting dependencies and outcomes. If this happened before that, the door stayed open. If it happened after, the door closed. They were moving closer to the closed door every day. I noticed how Allison stopped asking my opinion entirely. He didn't even pretend anymore. He spoke about his future as if it existed in a separate dimension, one I wouldn't be joining. That detachment hurt more than I expected, but it also clarified things. I wasn't losing a partnership. I was stepping out of a role that had already ended. Victoria became more visible in small ways. Her name appeared in scheduling emails that crossed my screen accidentally. Her preferences dictated timelines. She needed things expedited. She couldn't wait. Every time Allison adjusted to meet her urgency, he tightened the sequence he didn't know he was completing. She thought pressure created opportunity. She had no idea it created exposure. I stayed consistent. I didn't change my behavior, my routines, my tone. I didn't become suspicious or distant. I didn't ask to see documents or question transfers. I let Allison believe he had managed me perfectly, that my compliance was permanent. That belief made him sloppy. One evening he mentioned the lawyer again, this time with a trace of irritation. There had been questions, clarifications, requests for additional documentation. Nothing serious, he said, just part of the process. He waved it away as bureaucracy. I nodded, my expression neutral. Inside, I noted the timing. Questions meant scrutiny. Scrutiny meant the system was already beginning to look. That night, I stood in the kitchen after he went to bed, holding a single sheet of paper I had printed earlier. It wasn't evidence. It wasn't an accusation. It was a procedural form, blank and unremarkable, the kind of thing no one notices until it's filed. I didn't fill it out yet. I wanted to be certain, not emotionally certain, structurally certain. The temptation to act early was strong. There is comfort in action, even misguided action. It gives the illusion of control. But I had learned that the most effective move is often restraint. Waiting until the moment when action cannot be undone. I reminded myself of that when doubt crept in. When guilt whispered that I was being cruel by letting things go this far. When the old habit of self-sacrifice tried to reassert itself. I wasn't doing this to hurt them. I was doing this to stop disappearing. The next few days unfolded exactly as expected. Final confirmations came through. Conversations shifted from preparation to anticipation. Allison's family spoke about celebration dinners and new beginnings. They had already emotionally relocated, leaving behind whatever complications remained. Including me. I watched them congratulate themselves on how smoothly everything had gone. I listened as they praised each other for foresight and coordination. They believed intelligence was measured by how little resistance they encountered. They mistook absence for agreement. By then, I knew the window had narrowed to days. The sequence was almost complete. All the conditions that had once existed independently were converging. Once the final step occurred, the system would have no choice but to respond. I didn't need to be involved beyond that. I folded the printed form and placed it back where it belonged, unopened, unfinished. Not yet. Timing mattered more than readiness. Precision mattered more than courage. That evening, Allison talked about travel plans with an ease that bordered on relief. He sounded lighter, unburdened, as if shedding the life we had built together was a logistical inconvenience he was finally resolving. I listened, asking neutral questions, offering nothing of myself. As I lay in bed later, I felt something settle inside me. Not satisfaction, not anger, resolve. The kind that doesn't announce itself or demand validation. I understood then that I wasn't waiting because I was afraid. I was waiting because the moment hadn't arrived. And when it did, I would only need to do one thing. Just one. Then I would let go. And let the system speak for me. The closer they came to leaving, the more invisible I became. That was the strange part. As plans solidified, I faded from consideration entirely. Allison stopped checking in with me even out of habit. His family no longer bothered lowering their voices. They spoke around me, not to me, as if I were furniture that had always been there and always would be. I listened without reacting. They talked about timelines now, not possibilities. Flights were discussed with confidence, accommodations were compared and evaluated. Accounts were confirmed, then reconfirmed. Every conversation carried the tone of completion, of something already decided and simply waiting to happen. I noticed how often the word final appeared. Final documents, final approvals, final transfers. Final always sounds comforting to people who believe they're in control. I kept my routine unchanged. I woke early, made coffee, graded papers at the kitchen table. I went to work and taught my classes, my voice steady as I discussed themes of consequence and causality. I smiled when colleagues asked about my weekend. I nodded when Allison talked about his schedule. Consistency became my camouflage. Inside, though, I was counting. Not days exactly, conditions. Each night I reviewed my notes and cross-checked what I had overheard. When a new document was mentioned, I noted it. When a transfer was confirmed, I marked it. When Allison mentioned a signature or authorization, I listened carefully for what kind it was and when it had occurred. They were building momentum, and momentum has a sound. It hums, it drowns out caution. Victoria's urgency intensified everything. She pushed for confirmations, for reassurances, for proof that nothing could go wrong. Her impatience filtered through Allison, tightening his responses, shortening his tolerance for delay. He wanted to deliver certainty to her, to prove he had everything under control. That desire made him predictable. One evening, Allison mentioned an email he was waiting on, something about clearance and review. He said it casually, almost dismissively, as if mentioning it aloud would strip it of importance. He laughed and said bureaucracy always slowed things down at the last minute. I smiled and agreed. Inside, I felt the quiet click of another piece sliding into place. Review meant visibility. Visibility meant sequence. I didn't open the printed form yet, but I took it out again, holding it in my hands as I stood alone in the kitchen. It felt heavier now, not because of what it would do, but because of what it represented. A boundary I would be crossing. A decision that would no longer be reversible once made. I asked myself one last time if there was another way, if speaking up could still change things, if warning Allison might stop the damage before it spread. The answer was clear. Any warning now would only help them adapt. It would give them time to unwind the sequence, to refile, to restructure. The system responds to completed patterns, not intentions interrupted halfway through. If I wanted the truth to surface, I had to let them finish. The temptation to interfere flared briefly when Allison spoke about his future, as if I weren't in it at all. Not cruelly, just practically. He talked about logistics, about how everything would be simpler soon, about how stress would finally lift. He never asked what that meant for me. That omission hurt in a way I hadn't expected, sharp and sudden. For a moment I felt the old instinct rise, the urge to matter, to be seen, to force acknowledgement. I let it pass. I wasn't doing this to be recognized. I was doing this so I could stop erasing myself to keep others comfortable. The final confirmation came quietly. A short conversation between Allison and his sister, overheard from the hallway. Everything was aligned. All that remained was execution. They were close enough now that they felt safe celebrating. That night, as Allison slept, I sat at the dining table and filled out the form. I didn't rush. I wrote carefully, checking each field twice. I attached only what was required. No commentary, no emotion, just facts, arranged in the order the system expected. It took less than an hour. When I finished, I folded the papers neatly and placed them in an envelope. I didn't feel relief. I felt gravity, the weight of knowing that something important had shifted, even if no one else could see it yet. I didn't send it immediately. I waited until the morning, until the moment aligned with everything else they had set in motion. Timing mattered. I wanted the system to see the full picture, not fragments. When I finally submitted it, there was no dramatic pause. No confirmation screen that told me what would happen next. Just a quiet acknowledgement that the process had begun. I went to work afterward, taught my classes, and returned home as usual. Allison was distracted, energized, already halfway gone in his mind. He talked about last-minute details and asked if I needed anything. I said no. That evening, I felt an unfamiliar calm settle over me. Not excitement, not satisfaction, just certainty. The kind that comes when you know you've done everything you can, and the rest is no longer yours to manage. They believed the most dangerous part was over. They didn't realize the system had just started paying attention. And once it does, it doesn't look away. The documents stopped looking ordinary the moment I realized they were no longer separate. What I had once seen as stacks of paper, forms, statements, confirmations, began to align in my mind like pieces of a single structure. Dates overlapped, authorizations referenced each other, transfers echoed prior signatures. The language repeated itself in subtle ways, not by accident but by design. I slowed down. I reread everything I had already read, this time without skimming, without the assumption that anything was harmless just because it was familiar. The clauses I had once ignored now felt deliberate, as if they had been waiting for someone to pay attention long enough to understand what they actually did. The danger wasn't hidden. That was the unsettling part. It was visible. It had always been visible. There was a condition embedded in the agreements we had signed years earlier, buried among provisions that most people never revisit. It didn't accuse, it didn't threaten. It simply stated what would happen if assets jointly held were moved or reassigned in a way that suggested concealment or avoidance. It didn't care why. It didn't ask for motive. It responded to behavior. I sat at the table, the room quiet around me, and felt the shift happen internally. This was no longer speculation. This was confirmation. Everything they were doing, every rushed transfer, every authorization without disclosure, every attempt to outrun obligations was feeding into that condition. They weren't just close to triggering scrutiny. They already had. I began connecting the final threads, the passport applications that required updated financial disclosures, the account movements timed just before travel confirmations, the power of attorney language Allison had insisted on, framed as convenience, now reading like exposure. Individually, each step was defensible. Together, they formed a pattern no system was designed to ignore. I didn't feel triumph, I felt stillness. The flashbacks returned, clearer than before. Allison urging me to sign something quickly because the office was closing. His sister talking through details while I held a pen, distracted and eager to be done. His mother smiling reassuringly, telling me not to worry so much, that this was all routine. They hadn't lied to me. They had minimized. There's a difference, and I understood it now. They believed that because nothing had gone wrong before, nothing ever would. They trusted momentum more than caution, loyalty more than legality. I saw those moments now not as betrayals but as conveniences. Times when speed mattered more than consent, when my silence made everything easier. That silence had protected them then. It wouldn't protect them now. For the first time since this began, I considered warning them, not out of kindness, but out of instinct, a reflexive urge to prevent disaster before it fully unfolded. I imagined calling Allison, telling him to stop, to slow down, to reconsider what he was doing. The image didn't last. Any warning would only help them. It would give them time to adjust, to undo the sequence before it completed itself. Systems don't respond to near misses. They respond to completed actions. I understood that restraint wasn't passivity, it was strategy. As the days passed, their confidence grew. The closer they came to leaving, the more relaxed they became. I noticed the way conversations shortened, how Allison stopped checking his phone as often. Relief crept into his voice. He believed the hardest part was behind him. His family mirrored that belief. They began discussing plans beyond the move, as if the transition were already over. There was laughter, speculation, a sense of release. No one asked me anything. I watched them from a distance that felt newly earned. Not emotional distance, I had lived with that for years, but strategic distance. I no longer felt pulled into their urgency or affected by their certainty. Time had shifted. I recognized the exact moment when the balance tipped. It was small, almost unnoticeable. A sentence Allison repeated from his lawyer without understanding its weight. A word like review, used casually, as if it were a temporary inconvenience rather than a process with its own momentum. That was when I knew. Once review begins, it doesn't care about intentions. It doesn't negotiate. It observes, verifies, and responds. The closer they moved toward departure, the more visible their actions became. They believed they were almost free. I knew they were almost exposed. That knowledge didn't make me reckless. It made me patient. I didn't need to do anything else. I didn't need to check my submission or monitor progress. The system doesn't require supervision once it's engaged. All it needs is time. I went about my days as usual. I taught my classes, graded essays, cooked dinner. I listened when Allison talked, nodded when appropriate, offered nothing that might redirect attention. Inside, I felt the certainty deepen. They thought I had been quiet because I was powerless. They didn't understand that I had been quiet because I was waiting for them to finish. And now they had. There was nothing left for me to uncover, nothing left to prepare. The structure was complete, the sequence intact. All that remained was the moment when the consequences would make themselves known. I didn't rush it. I let it arrive on its own. I knew the action had to be small, almost disappointing if anyone were watching. Big gestures create noise. Noise invites resistance. I wasn't interested in resistance. I wanted inevitability, the kind that doesn't announce itself until it's already too late to turn back. For days, I did nothing. That restraint mattered. By then, everything they needed to leave was aligned. Documents finalized, accounts positioned. Conversations shifted from preparation to execution. They spoke as if the future were already behind them, as if the hardest part had been surviving the waiting. They never considered that waiting could belong to someone else. I chose the timing with care, not emotionally but structurally. After the last transfer cleared, after the final authorization was signed, after the passport confirmations arrived. There was a narrow window when all their actions would be visible at once, when nothing could be reframed as incomplete or accidental. That was the moment I waited for. The step itself took less time than making a cup of coffee. I didn't accuse anyone. I didn't raise concerns or ask for intervention. I submitted what already existed, arranged exactly as required, through a process designed to receive it without commentary. No explanation, no justification. Just the record. I remember noticing how ordinary the interface looked. Clean, neutral, almost indifferent. There was no sense of drama, no warning about consequences. Just a confirmation that the materials had been received and would be reviewed in due course. That was all. I didn't sit there waiting for something to happen. I didn't check my email obsessively or refresh any screens. I closed the laptop, wiped down the counter, and went to bed. The action had already left my hands. The next morning, I returned to my routine as if nothing had changed. I woke early, dressed for work, packed my lunch. Allison was distracted but relaxed, moving through the house with a confidence that bordered on relief. He talked about last-minute details, about wrapping things up. I listened. I offered neutral responses. Nothing in my voice suggested that anything had shifted. That invisibility mattered. Throughout the day, I focused on small things. My students' essays, a conversation in the teacher's lounge, the rhythm of ordinary responsibilities. I didn't check for updates. I didn't look for signs. Waiting without watching is harder than it sounds. There's a temptation to seek reassurance, to confirm that a decision mattered. But reassurance would have been about me. This wasn't. By evening, I noticed the first subtle change. Allison was quieter, not alarmed, just distracted. He checked his phone more often, frowned once or twice, then smoothed his expression when he noticed me watching. He didn't say anything. Neither did I. Over the next day, the tension became slightly more visible. Conversations with his family grew shorter. He took a call outside, his voice low but strained. When he came back in, he seemed preoccupied, as if something minor had gone wrong but hadn't yet earned concern. I recognized that phase. It's the moment when people sense friction but still believe control will reassert itself. They thought they were dealing with a delay. I knew they were dealing with a process. I didn't adjust my behavior. I didn't lean in or pull away. I continued exactly as I had before, because consistency is the strongest form of camouflage. Any change would have drawn attention. Any reaction could have redirected suspicion. The hardest part was resisting the urge to explain nothing. To let them believe the tension was external, technical, temporary. People are most vulnerable when they still believe resolution is a matter of effort. That night, Allison asked if everything felt okay between us. The question was vague, poorly timed, and deeply revealing. He wasn't asking because he cared. He was checking for instability, for variables he hadn't accounted for. I told him everything was fine. It wasn't a lie. Fine doesn't mean intact, it means settled. I felt settled for the first time in months. After he went to bed, I stood alone in the living room, the house quiet around me. I didn't feel satisfaction or fear. I felt distance, the kind that comes from knowing you've crossed a line you won't cross back over. The system was already moving, even if it hadn't spoken yet. Systems don't rush, they collect, they compare, they verify, they wait until the full picture is clear. I didn't need confirmation to know that picture was complete. The next morning, Allison mentioned a call he needed to return. He said it casually, but his voice betrayed impatience. Not panic yet, just the irritation of someone used to things going smoothly. I nodded and finished my coffee. I didn't need to look at the clock to know what time it was. The step I had taken couldn't be undone now, not without unraveling everything they had worked so carefully to build. Any attempt to intervene would only add to the record, deepen the visibility. They had reached the point where silence no longer protected them. I had pressed one button and stepped back. Now all I had to do was wait while the system did what it had always been designed to do. And systems, once engaged, don't ask permission to proceed. The morning they believed was final began like every other ordinary morning they had already mentally left behind. Suitcases stood upright near the door, zipped and waiting. Documents were stacked neatly on the kitchen counter, organized in folders Allison had labeled with quiet pride. His phone buzzed repeatedly with confirmations, updates, reminders. He moved through the house with purpose, efficient and focused, as if every step brought him closer to freedom. I watched without comment. They were running on certainty now, the kind that comes after months of planning, when anticipation replaces caution. No one double-checks what they believe is already secured. No one questions momentum when it feels earned. The first interruption was small enough to dismiss. A transfer that didn't reflect immediately. Allison frowned at his screen, refreshed it once, then set the phone down. "Probably just a delay," he said, more to himself than to me. His tone was casual, unbothered. He had built his life on the assumption that systems corrected themselves. Minutes passed, then more. His sister called. I could hear her voice through the speaker, sharp with irritation. Something about access, something about an account that wasn't responding the way it should. Allison waved it off, reassuring her that he would handle it. I recognized the moment momentum shifted. Confusion arrived quietly, without alarm bells or raised voices. They treated it like an inconvenience, an unexpected speed bump on an otherwise smooth road. Allison made a few calls, pacing slightly now, his confidence still intact but thinning at the edges. Then another issue surfaced. A second account flagged, a notification he didn't understand. The language on the screen was neutral, almost polite, but it introduced a word they hadn't prepared for. Review. That was when irritation turned into unease. Phones began to ring more frequently, conversations overlapped, explanations were repeated, then rephrased. Allison's voice grew sharper as he tried to force clarity where none was being offered. Every answer he received sounded the same, even when phrased differently. This shouldn't be happening. I stayed where I was, quiet and still, watching the confidence drain from the room. The problem multiplied quickly. Transfers reversed. Access restricted. Requests for clarification that came without timelines or assurances. The system wasn't asking questions in a way that could be answered with confidence. It was observing. Allison's family gathered closer, their earlier excitement replaced by tension. They spoke over one another now, trying to reconstruct who had handled what, who had spoken to which advisor, who might have missed a step. No one looked at me. When the lawyer arrived, I knew before he spoke that something had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. His face was pale in a way that had nothing to do with panic and everything to do with recognition. He didn't rush into explanations. He didn't soften his words. He listened. Then he sighed slowly and said the one thing no one wanted to hear. "This isn't a single issue." The room fell silent. He explained carefully, choosing his words with precision. The accounts weren't frozen because of an error. The delay wasn't temporary. The review wasn't procedural in the way they understood procedure. It was comprehensive. Everything they had done separately was now being viewed together. I watched Allison absorb that information in real time. His posture changed. The confidence he had worn like armor slipped, replaced by something unfamiliar. Not fear yet. Disbelief. Victoria stood slightly apart from the group, her expression unreadable. She checked her phone, then slipped it back into her bag. She didn't argue. She didn't ask questions. She understood instinctively what Allison was still trying to deny. Momentum had betrayed them. The lawyer continued, explaining what review meant in practical terms. Timelines extended. Access restricted. Movement halted. Once the process began, there was no mechanism to rush it or override it. Cooperation might help. Resistance would not. No one spoke. I realized then how fragile their unity had been. Without forward motion, it collapsed inward. Subtle blame began to surface, not openly, but in glances and tone. Who had insisted on speed? Who had coordinated what? Who had said everything was fine? They had planned to leave together. Now they were trapped together. Allison finally looked at me, as if seeing me for the first time that morning. There was a question in his eyes, unformed and uncertain, not an accusation, not yet. Just the instinctive search for stability when everything else begins to wobble. I gave him nothing. The lawyer packed up his papers, his movements efficient but heavy. He said he would be in touch. He didn't offer reassurance. Professionals don't do that when the outcome is no longer flexible. After he left, the house felt smaller. The suitcases remained by the door, untouched. The documents on the counter suddenly looked less like tickets and more like evidence. I felt no satisfaction as the reality settled in, no surge of triumph, just confirmation. The kind that arrives when something you understood in theory finally proves itself in practice. They thought something had gone wrong. I knew something had gone exactly right. There was no fixing this now, no reordering the sequence, no explaining intent. The system had everything it needed, and it would take its time. As the family continued to talk in circles, I stepped away quietly, retreating to the part of the house that had always belonged to me. For the first time in months, I felt certain about what came next. They were no longer moving forward. They were contained. And once that happens, everything else is just consequence. The panic didn't arrive all at once. It crept in through repetition. Phones rang again and again, the same numbers cycling through the house as if calling harder might change the answers. Allison spoke in fragments now, his sentences breaking off as soon as they began. He paced from room to room, repeating explanations to people who had already told him they couldn't help. "This has to be temporary," he said more than once, not to anyone in particular. "We've done everything right." No one argued with him, they just kept dialing. The first strategy was denial disguised as efficiency. They told themselves it was a technical delay, a misunderstanding that could be clarified with the right contact. Allison's brother suggested a different advisor. His sister insisted on escalating the issue. Someone mentioned pulling favors, calling in old relationships. Authority had always worked for them before. This time, authority stalled at the edges of procedure. Each call ended the same way. Polite voices, careful language, no promises. The phrase "under review" repeated so often it began to lose meaning, becoming a wall rather than an explanation. The more they pushed, the less control they seemed to have. I watched the shift happen without moving. What surprised me wasn't the panic. It was how quickly their certainty evaporated once reassurance was no longer available. They weren't angry yet. They were disoriented. People accustomed to momentum rarely know what to do when motion stops. The lawyer returned the next day, calmer than before, which made everything worse. Calm in situations like this doesn't signal solutions. It signals boundaries. He explained what they were facing in practical terms. No raised voices, no judgment, just facts. The review would take time. Access would remain restricted. Certain transactions would not be permitted until the process concluded. Attempting to circumvent it could complicate matters. He didn't say impossible. He didn't need to. The family tried to negotiate with him as if he were the system itself. Questions overlapped. Hypotheticals piled up. They searched for exceptions, loopholes, alternative routes. He listened, answered carefully, and offered nothing that sounded like hope. When he left, something in the house fractured. Blame didn't explode, it seeped. Small comments, side glances, a question phrased just sharply enough to wound. Someone wondered aloud who had insisted on moving so quickly. Someone else questioned whether all disclosures had been handled properly. Victoria stayed quiet through most of it, watching more than speaking. When she did talk, it was to ask practical questions about timelines and contingencies. Her voice was controlled, her concern focused inward. She wasn't interested in salvaging a partnership, she was interested in minimizing loss. That, more than anything, seemed to unsettle Allison. He tried to pull the group back together, insisting they needed to stay coordinated. He talked about strategy as if strategy still existed, but coordination requires trust, and trust was the first thing to crack. By evening, the calls slowed. Not because anything had improved, but because there was no one left to call. The house grew quiet in a way that felt heavy rather than peaceful. Plans that had once filled every corner of conversation had nowhere to go. That was when Allison turned toward me. It wasn't a confrontation, not yet. It was tentative, almost careful. He asked neutral questions, testing the ground. Had I noticed anything unusual? Had any mail arrived that he might have missed? Did anything seem off to me? The questions were revealing in their vagueness. He wasn't accusing me. He was searching for stability, for something familiar to anchor himself to now that everything else felt uncertain. I answered honestly, which was to say, I answered minimally. I told him I hadn't noticed anything. I told him the mail had been normal. I told him I hoped things worked out. Hope is a useful word when you want to end a conversation without offering commitment. He nodded, unsatisfied but unable to push further. Pushing requires leverage, and he no longer had any. That night, the family gathered again, their energy subdued. They spoke about next steps in conditional language now, every sentence hedged. If this clears. If that changes. If the review ends sooner than expected. No one mentioned departure. The suitcases remained by the door, unopened but no longer symbolic. They had become objects of discomfort, reminders of a future that had collapsed into uncertainty. I moved through the house quietly, doing what I always did, clearing dishes, wiping counters, preparing for the next day. Normalcy has a way of amplifying instability. It makes chaos feel smaller, more exposed. Inside, I felt none of what they were feeling. No panic, no urgency, no need to fix anything. The system had taken over. There was nothing left for me to do. Late that evening, Allison received another call. He stepped outside to take it, his posture tense. When he came back in, he didn't speak right away. He sat down heavily, as if the weight of the situation had finally reached him. They said it could take months, he said quietly. No one responded. Months meant missed windows, missed opportunities, missed momentum. Everything they had built the plan around depended on movement, and movement was no longer available to them. I understood then that the resistance phase was over. This wasn't something they could argue their way out of or maneuver around. Time, once their ally, had turned against them. They were still asking how to fix it. I knew there was nothing left to fix. The system doesn't negotiate once it begins. It observes records and proceeds at its own pace. And the more you resist, the clearer the record becomes. As the house settled into an uneasy quiet, I felt a sense of containment take hold. Not relief, not victory, containment. The knowledge that the damage could no longer spread, that the momentum they had relied on was gone. They had reached the edge of what influence could accomplish. Everything that followed would be consequence. The silence after panic is heavier than the panic itself. When the calls stopped and the house finally grew still, it wasn't peace that settled in. It was something denser, a quiet thick with consequence, the kind that doesn't demand attention but refuses to be ignored. I noticed it in the way people moved more carefully, as if any sudden motion might make things worse. Days passed, not in dramatic leaps, but in measured stretches where nothing seemed to change and yet everything had. The suitcases were moved out of the hallway, tucked away into a closet like an embarrassment no one wanted to acknowledge. The folders disappeared from the counter. Travel confirmations went unopened. Nothing was officially canceled yet, but nothing was moving forward either. That was the cost of scrutiny. It didn't explode lives. It slowed them until the wait became unavoidable. Allison changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. His voice lost its edge. The certainty that had once filled his sentences drained away, replaced by careful phrasing and pauses. He spoke less about plans and more about hypotheticals, always framed in ifs. If the review clears soon, if the accounts reopen, if things settle. He was no longer steering, he was waiting. I watched this shift without satisfaction. I had imagined once that seeing him weakened might feel like justice. It didn't. It felt like watching someone realize, too late, that the ground they'd been standing on was never solid. He tried to talk to me more. Not directly, not honestly. He circled conversations the way he always had, testing for reassurance without asking for it. He wanted to know if I was all right, if the situation felt stressful for me, if I needed anything. What he was really asking was whether I would stabilize him the way I always had. I didn't. I answered politely. Kindly, even. But I didn't step back into the role he had quietly assigned me years ago. I didn't absorb his uncertainty or translate his fear into calm. I let his discomfort remain his. That boundary felt new and necessary. His family fractured in quieter ways. Visits became shorter, conversations more guarded. Some of them avoided the subject entirely, retreating into awkward normalcy. Others whispered, looking for someone to blame without naming them outright. Victoria drifted further away. She didn't disappear suddenly. She simply became less present. Fewer messages, fewer appearances. Her questions turned practical, detached, focused on contingencies and exit options. She was no longer invested in waiting alongside them. Watching that unravel confirmed something I had already understood. What they had built together depended entirely on forward motion. Without it, there was nothing holding them in place. I never explained myself to anyone. There were moments when I considered it, usually in the quiet of early mornings when reflection felt heavier than resolve. I imagined telling Allison what I had done, laying out the logic, the clauses, the sequence. I imagined the shock on his face, the realization settling in. But each time the urge passed. I didn't need them to understand. Understanding would have shifted the focus back to them, back to their reactions, their feelings, their justifications. I wasn't interested in managing that anymore. The truth had already done its work. Explanation would only dilute it. What mattered was what had changed inside me. For the first time in years, I felt solid. Not angry, not triumphant. Solid. As if I had stepped back into my own outline after years of shrinking to fit someone else's life. I realized then that I hadn't won anything. I had stopped losing. That distinction mattered. Winning implies competition, a scoreboard, a moment of dominance. What I felt was quieter and far more permanent. I had reclaimed my boundaries, my voice, my right to exist without being managed or minimized. The systems were still doing what systems do, slow and methodical. Timelines stretched, access remained restricted, consequences unfolded without drama or negotiation. I returned to my routines with a new sense of presence. Teaching felt different. I stood straighter. I spoke with more certainty. Not because my life had become simpler, but because I was no longer carrying what wasn't mine to hold. At home, I moved through spaces that no longer felt hostile or heavy, just transitional, temporary. I began making small decisions for myself without consulting anyone. Simple things, rearranging a room, adjusting my schedule, claiming time. No one objected. There is a moment in every long silence when you realize it has shifted from something imposed to something chosen. That moment arrived quietly one evening, as I sat alone, the house dim around me. I wasn't waiting for anything anymore. Whatever happened next, legally, financially, relationally, would happen without my intervention. I had done what I needed to do. The rest belonged to processes larger than any of us. I thought back to the woman I had been at the beginning of all this. Careful, accommodating, afraid that speaking up would break something fragile. I understood her now without judgment. She had survived the only way she knew how. But survival was no longer the goal. I didn't destroy a family. I didn't take revenge in the way stories usually demand. I simply stopped protecting a lie that had been costing me myself. And in doing that, I stepped into a version of my life that didn't require permission. The quiet around me wasn't empty anymore. It was space. And for the first time, it felt like it belonged to me. Time didn't rush to reward anyone. It simply moved on. Weeks passed. Then months, marked not by announcements, but by absences. No more frantic calls. No more whispered strategy meetings in the kitchen. The house settled into a quieter rhythm, one that felt honest for the first time in years. Distance grew, not just between Allison and his plans, but between me and the life I had been quietly carrying for too long. I noticed it first in small ways. I stopped checking my phone for updates that weren't coming. I stopped measuring my days against his moods. The tension that once lived in my shoulders eased, replaced by a steadier awareness of where I was and what I needed. Silence, when chosen, felt different. It didn't bruise. It held. What they had left behind became clearer as the noise faded. Not money or documents or itineraries, but a story they had told themselves about control. They believed leaving would free them. They believed distance would erase obligations. They believed momentum could outrun accountability. They were wrong. I didn't feel vindicated watching the consequences settle. I felt resolved. The kind of resolution that doesn't require witnesses or applause. The kind that comes from standing still long enough to recognize your own outline again. Allison tried once to talk about the future. Not the escape he had planned, but a future reshaped by limits and delays. His voice was careful, his words tentative. He spoke as if the right phrasing might reopen a door that had quietly closed. I listened without offering direction. Not out of cruelty, but clarity. Guidance had always been my role in his life, and stepping away from it felt necessary. Some lessons only land when no one translates them for you. I didn't need to explain myself to feel complete. Explanation would have turned the ending into an argument, and I was finished arguing for my place. I had it. I had always had it. I had just stopped giving it away. What surprised me most was how life continued without drama once I stopped bracing for impact. Mornings arrived, work demanded attention, friendships resurfaced, unburdened by the quiet exhaustion I hadn't realized I carried. I made choices without rehearsing them in my head first. I said no without apology. I said yes without fear. Freedom, I learned, doesn't always look like escape. Sometimes it looks like staying and no longer shrinking. I thought often about the woman I used to be, the one who believed endurance was the same as loyalty, who mistook patience for peace. I don't judge her. She did what she knew how to do, but I don't live there anymore. The truth I carry now is simple. Silence can be a wound when it's imposed. It can be power when it's chosen. The difference is intention. I didn't destroy anything that wasn't already hollow. I didn't take revenge in the way stories promise. I let a system respond to actions that had already been taken, and I stepped back into myself while it did. If you've listened this far and recognized something familiar, if you've ever been underestimated, spoken around, quietly erased, know this: waiting does not mean weakness. Observing does not mean surrender. Sometimes the strongest move is refusing to rush toward noise and letting truth assemble itself. If this story resonated with you, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Not confessions, just reflections. What would you have done? What did this make you think about? And if you want to stay with me for more stories like this, stories about quiet strength, hidden leverage, and the moment control shifts without a single shout, consider staying here. Subscribe, settle in, and we'll keep exploring what justice looks like when it doesn't need to raise its voice. Thank you for listening. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.